My landlord told me I'd never afford to buy in this neighborhood. He had no idea I was the one who just bought the building he owned. For 6 years, I rented a modest one-bedroom apartment from a man named Gerald, the kind of landlord who managed his properties personally, showed up unannounced for routine inspections, and never missed an opportunity to remind tenants exactly how fortunate they were to live in a neighborhood that had, in his words, gotten too expensive for people like you to ever actually own here. Gerald said this to me more than once, always with the same tone, somewhere between concern and quiet condescension. Once, when I mentioned, casually, that I was interested in real estate, he laughed, not unkindly exactly, and said, "Renting is smart for people in your position. Owning around here takes real money, the kind that takes generations to build, not the kind you save up waiting tables and doing whatever else it is you do." What Gerald didn't know, what I'd never mentioned because our relationship existed entirely within the narrow scope of rent payments and maintenance requests, was that whatever else it is you do happened to be structuring commercial real estate deals for a boutique investment firm, work I'd built quietly over nearly a decade after starting as an unpaid intern the same year I moved into Gerald's building. I didn't discuss my career with my landlord any more than I discussed my finances with my mail carrier. Our relationship required a signed lease and a functioning radiator, nothing more. I stayed in that apartment far longer than my income alone would have required, partly out of genuine affection for the neighborhood, and partly, if I'm honest, because Gerald's building, despite its owner's personality, had a rent-controlled unit I'd been strategically holding on to while I built capital elsewhere. I lived modestly, invested aggressively, and let Gerald believe exactly what he wanted to believe about the quiet tenant in Unit 4B who always paid on time and never caused problems. 3 years ago, my firm began quietly acquiring a small portfolio of residential buildings in transitional neighborhoods, precisely the kind of properties that were, according to landlords like Gerald, becoming too expensive for people like that to ever own. I wasn't personally involved in every acquisition, but I made a point of reviewing the full portfolio regularly, partly out of genuine professional interest, and partly, I'll admit, out of an idle curiosity about which buildings, exactly, might eventually cross my desk. Gerald's building came up for sale 18 months ago, after he decided, at 68, that property management had become more trouble than it's worth. My firm's acquisitions team flagged it immediately, both for its financials and its location, without any knowledge, initially, that I happened to be one of the tenants currently occupying Unit 4B. I found out through an internal deal memo, the same way I found out about any potential acquisition, scrolling through property details, projected returns, current tenant information. When I saw the address, I sat with it for a long, strange moment before continuing to review the rest of the document as professionally as I could manage. I didn't personally lead the acquisition. I recused myself from any direct negotiation, the same careful boundary I'd learned to maintain in situations involving personal conflicts of interest, and let our standard team handle due diligence and closing exactly as they would with any other property. The deal closed quietly, 4 months later, through our firm's holding company. A name that meant absolutely nothing to Gerald or, frankly, to most of my coworkers outside the immediate deal team. Gerald mentioned the sale to me himself, in the hallway, a few weeks before closing, mentioning offhandedly that the new owners were some investment company, and that he hoped they'd treat the building and its tenants fairly. I told him I was sure they would. I wasn't lying. I'd personally reviewed the property management transition plan and made certain existing leases, rent-controlled units included, would be honored exactly as required by law, with genuinely improved maintenance response times built into the new operating budget. The truth came out almost by accident, nearly 6 months after closing, at a small gathering our firm hosted for portfolio property tenants. A goodwill event meant to introduce the new management team and answer questions about upcoming building improvements. Gerald, invited as the previous owner for a brief handoff conversation, was there. I was there too, in my professional capacity, not as a tenant that evening, but as a representative of the firm that now owned the building I still lived in. Gerald recognized me immediately, understandably confused about why his former tenant was standing near the firm's leadership table instead of the resident section. I explained, plainly, without any dramatics, that I worked for the firm that had acquired his building, and had, in fact, been a long-standing tenant in Unit 4B the entire time he'd known me. He was quiet for a long moment, processing, I think, the specific irony of having spent 6 years telling the woman in 4B that people like her could never afford to own property in this neighborhood, while she'd been quietly working on the exact deal that would eventually put his own building under her firm's management. "You could have told me," he said eventually, not accusingly, more genuinely bewildered. I told him the truth. There had never been a natural moment to correct his assumptions about my finances during a conversation about a leaking faucet or a late rent check. And more honestly, some part of me had simply grown accustomed, over years of comments like his, to letting people underestimate what I was capable of, because correcting them rarely felt worth the effort it required. Gerald retired fully after that, moving to be closer to his adult children in another state. Before he left, he stopped by Unit 4B one last time, not for an inspection, but simply to say, somewhat sheepishly, that he hoped I knew he'd meant well, even if his comments over the years had clearly underestimated exactly who he was talking to. I still live in that building, though I've since moved into a larger unit 2 floors up, one I now lease at full market rate, entirely by choice. Because I like the neighborhood, and because staying felt like its own quiet answer to years of being told I never truly belonged there. If you've ever been told by someone in a position of assumed authority over you, a landlord, a boss, a relative, exactly what you could and couldn't afford, achieve, or become, remember this: people who underestimate you based on your current circumstances rarely bother imagining what those circumstances are quietly building toward. Sometimes the person renting the modest apartment down the hall ends up holding considerably more power over the building than the person who owns it. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Silent Empire. New story every week, subscribe so you never miss one. See you in the next one.